Right, guys, we're looking at the poem Out Out, written by Robert Frost, very well-known American poet, died around the 1960s, 1963 if I'm not mistaken. Right, so this poem was published in 1916, and before we analyze the poem any further, I trust that you guys have read through the poem already and have a pretty good idea of what it's about. It's not a difficult poem, the narrative's quite a simple one. So let's have a look and see what we can kind of pull apart in terms of the poem. You know, even when a poem is simple, there's always things to look at, particularly when you are educated enough to have the tools to do so, and that is really, really important. Alright, so a buzzsaw, first of all, is think of a desk with a large, round, circular, sharp-toothed edge saw spinning around. Your typical example of a saw in the movies where somebody's tied down on a conveyor belt and they're heading towards the saw, that kind of thing. All right. Sometimes they refer to a little handheld circular saw as a buzz saw as well, but conventionally a buzz saw has its own, like a bench, it has its own little stand, and it's a large circular saw. All right. So it's snarled and rattled. That, of course, is onomatopoeia because that word represents a sound. So snarled is onomatopoeia, rattled is onomatopoeia. All right. Now you'll notice that I've skipped this first part up here. You'll see there's stuff written at the top there. You don't need to know that at grade 8 level. But just to quickly explain it to you as a matter of interest, the poem is written in blank verse. That means that it doesn't rhyme at all, but it's written in iambic pentameter, which means that there are 10 syllables per line. So you'll look, the buzz saw snarled and rattled in the yard, 10. And made dust and dropped stove length sticks of wood, 10. Alright, so interesting fact to know, and you will need to know about iambic pentameter soon, but I don't think that is what you need to know at this stage, so don't worry too much about that. Alright, so we see this buzzsaw snarling and rattling in the yard, and made dust and dropped stove length sticks of wood. Is it cutting wood for the stove? So there's no electricity, hinting towards a kind of rural setting. I know it is written in 1916 as well, but Robert Frost often did write about rural scenarios and settings, so it does make sense, certainly fitting in with his theme of poetry there. And sweet scented stuff when the breeze drew across it, this dust. Okay, so you'll know that when you cut wood with saws, I'm sure you guys have done that or helped a family member, your dad, your uncle or something, build something like that. You'll notice obviously that the sawdust and that smell, it's got quite a sweet smell. Right, so sweet scented stuff, that alliteration there, repetition of the S sound when the breeze drew across it. Alright, and from there, those that lifted eyes, in other words, those that looked up at the horizon, could count 5 mountain ranges, one behind the other, under the sunset, far into Vermont. Okay, so they're not in Vermont because it's the mountain ranges are going into Vermont. All right, we know that it's sunset because it tells us there, so it's getting late in the day. And we have this young boy working the saw. All right, Vermont is a city in northeastern USA. So if we are asked, how do we know that this poem is written in the United States of America, we can refer to the word Vermont. Please note that it is the United States of America. You can't just say America, because America could be 2 different continents. Alright, and the saw snarled and rattled, snarled and rattled. So again we have that onomatopoeia, and the repetition of that is because the saw is never ending. It just goes on and on. So it's mimicking the fact that the saw just makes this noise and goes on and on and on. And the saw is making that noise and rattling as it ran light or had to bear a load. If a saw runs light, it means that there's no wood that it's cutting, so it's just spinning freely. Or when it has to bear a load, in other words, when it has to cut wood. And you'll know that when you cut wood with a saw, the saw makes a slightly different sound. You can tell that it's straining a little bit under the load. And nothing happened. Day was all but done. Right? And nothing happened. In other words, it had just been an ordinary day. Nothing special had happened. The day was all but done. In other words, the day was almost over. They'd been working all day and it was almost done. Alright. Call it a day, I wish they might have said. I is referring to the speaker here, and he's saying, I wish whoever they is, the people in charge or the father or whoever it is in the setting, I wish they would have said, let's just call it early. Let's just stop working now. Because if they had said that, what follows in the poem wouldn't have happened. To please the boy by giving him the half hour. If they had said, call it a day, that would have pleased the boy. Because as a boy, you don't want to work. And if you can have time off, great. If you have to work till 7 o'clock and it's 6:30 and they say, no, let's call it a day, let's stop working now, that's fantastic. All right. So the fact that it says giving him the half hour means that we know that there's half an hour left of work. Right. That a boy counts so much when saved from work. So if I tell you, right guys, we have half an hour left, you've been working all day, you're going to count down that half an hour like a minute at a time. His sister stood beside him. So his sister, the boy's sister, stood beside them in her apron to tell them supper. Okay, so either she's made supper or she's been helping the mom make supper because she's got her apron on, and she's come outside to tell the father probably and the boy supper is ready. At the word, in other words, at that word supper, the saw, as if to prove saws knew what supper meant, trying to personify the saw here, the poet is saying, as if the saw had a brain and knew what the word supper meant, leapt out at the boy's hand or seemed to leap. In other words, the circular saw makes contact with the boy's hand. And he says it leapt out. But now you and I know that the saw can't leap out. It's not alive. All right. So he says it leapt out or seemed to leap because it didn't actually. He must have given the hand. In other words, the boy must have put his hand in the saw, obviously, because the saw is not going to reach out to the boy. The boy's going to put his hand in the saw. And why is he going to do that? Because he lost concentration due to the fact that his sister called him for supper. However it was, in other words, however it happened, the fact of the matter is that the boy's hand got caught in the saw. Neither refused the meeting. So the poet is saying here, well, whether it was the saw that leapt out to the boy's hand or the boy's hand who leapt out to the saw, which is obviously what happened, neither refused the meeting. They said, both the saw and the hand said, right, let's do this. And they got together. You understand what I'm saying there, all right? Kind of tongue-in-cheek there. It's not actually supposed to be humorous, but you understand what the poet is saying. But the hand, never mind about that. Let's forget about how it happened. The fact of the matter is that boy's hand, it's been cut up, it's been mauled, whatever the case is. I don't know if it's half hanging there by a thread or charred or what. The boy's first outcry was a rueful laugh. So, when something like that happens, it's such a shock that you might first of kind of also being a little bit embarrassed possibly that he's let this happen, something so foolish, gives a rueful laugh. It's not like it's funny laugh, it's more like a regretful laugh. As he swung towards them holding up his hand. Why is he holding up his hand? Well, half in appeal, in other words, half to say, help, look what's happened to my hand, can everybody see? But also half as if to keep the life from spilling. The blood is obviously pouring out his hand now, and he wants to try and stop the blood squirting out because he's going to die. So the life here actually refers to the blood. Then the boy saw all. So at that point, the boy looks at his hand and he actually recognizes the extent of the damage, what has actually happened. Since he was old enough to know, big boy doing a man's work, it is a man's work. The boy shouldn't be doing that work, but because of the circumstances and being in a rural setting and you don't have lots of fancy machinery and think who else is going to do it. Okay, so the boy is kind of forced to have to do it because they need wood for their stove and their fire and that. So anyway, big boy doing a man's work, though a child at heart. Of course, he's still a child. He's still a child at heart, but he's old enough to know that the damage that's been done to his hand is serious. He saw all spoiled. Okay, so then the boy saw all, since he was old enough to know, big boy doing man's work, though a child at heart. These two lines here tell me, even though he's a child, he recognizes the severity of the problem. He saw all spoiled. He saw and comprehended the damage. Like, this is serious. Then the boy says, and we know this because we've got inverted commas there, Don't let him cut my hand off, the doctor, when he comes. Don't let him, sister. So the boy is concerned about his hand being amputated. And he's trying to say that, listen, that would be a terrible thing for, it's not very dignified to have that happen to you. It's humiliating, not to mention, obviously, a problem as well for the future. So he's saying, please don't let them cut my hand off. He says that to his sister. He's pleading with his sister. So, but the hand was gone already. In other words, the hand cannot be saved. It's too badly damaged. The doctor put him in the dark of ether. So the doctor obviously arrives, and he puts the boy in the dark of ether. The dark of ether, a chemical, refers to anesthetic, all right, which numbs the pain, all right. If you have a local anesthetic, like you have an operation, then you can't feel anything and you are unconscious, you go to sleep. If you have that's a general anesthetic, my bad. If you have a local anesthetic, then you are still awake, but you just can't feel anything in that area. All right, so anyway, 1916 we're talking, he put him in the dark of ether, and ether is the anesthetic. He lay and puffed his lips, so the boy lay and puffed his lips out with his breath, and then the watcher at his pulse took fright. In other words, the person, whether it's the doctor checking his pulse, took fright. He got shocked. No one believed that this had just happened. They listened at his heart. Little, less, nothing. So he's listening to his heartbeat. Heartbeat is faint, gets more faint, and eventually there's no heartbeat at all. The boy has now died. And that ended it. In other words, we had this very short commotion and panic and stress, and and suddenly now that's it. It's done. Boy's dead. It's over. No more to build on there. That's the poet or the speaker's way of saying that was it. There was nothing else to say. There was nothing else. 1 minute the boy's fine, the next minute he's dead. Just like that. And they, since they were not the one dead, turned to their affairs. The onlookers just accepted the death and carried on with life, which seems incredibly insensitive and selfish. I mean, it's quite shocking, really, if you think about it. That you say you have a son or a younger brother, and he just dies there. And everybody thinks, well, I'm not the one that's dead. I'm okay still. And carried on doing what they were doing. Now, you can't tell me that that is just insignificant. There's a reason why Robert Frost has written that. And the extent of it is to say, well, life goes on. And sometimes things happen that are terrible. But it happens. And, no amount of kind of reminiscing or wishing it hadn't happened or going over the situation in your mind is going to do anything. It's going to help you. Now, you and I understand that that is very cold and certainly not realistic. At least it shouldn't be anyway. But that is the fact. That is the point that the poet is trying to make. The message that he's trying to give across is that life goes on and terrible things happen. Now, there is a kind of notion that, considering that the time that this was written, World War I was happening, and a lot of young men were dying unnecessarily, and they didn't die in a dignified manner. They would die on the battlefield, and the soldiers that were around had to just ignore the bodies that were dropping around them and lying there, and people dead and half dead and things like that. And so, although this has got nothing to do with war, considering the time period that it was written, we can make the argument that Frost was saying that listen how this young boy's life just disappears, how it's just ended without a proper explanation. We can't actually tell how it happened, and it happened so quickly, and it happened in an indignified manner as well. So really, if you look at that kind of World War I theme, it does make sense, and it does fit quite nicely. But I wouldn't look or get too worried about that. At your level, it's really right now just about looking at the poem, looking at the figures of speech, and understanding what all the lines mean and the overall message